Okay, the title of my talk is Trotsky's Lies, what they are and what they mean. In 1980, the Harvard Trotsky Archive was opened to researchers. Within a few days, Pierre Brouet, the foremost Trotskyist historian of his time, discovered that Trotsky had lied. Trotsky had always denied in the strongest terms that any clandestine bloc of oppositionists, including Trotskyists, had existed in the Soviet Union. Trotsky called this an amalgam, by which he meant a fabrication by Stalin. This bloc had been the main focus of the Second and Third Moscow trials of January 1937 and March 1938. I'm sure you've all heard of the Moscow trials. Okay. Brouet showed from letters in the Trotsky archive by Trotsky and by his son Leon Sedov that the bloc did exist. In 1985, American historian Arch Getty discovered that the Harvard Trotsky Archive had been purged of incriminating materials, but purged imperfectly. Getty found evidence that Trotsky had indeed remained in contact with some of his former supporters inside the Soviet Union, during the 1930s. Trotsky always strenuously denied this, claiming that he cut off all ties to those who, quote, capitulated to Stalin, and publicly renounced their Trotskyist views. Again, Trotsky was lying. In 2005, I began to systematically study all the accusations against Stalin and Lavrentiy Beria that Nikita Khrushchev made in his infamous secret speech in 1956. Anti-communists and Trotskyists usually call these accusations revelations, as though they were true. I discovered that not a single one of Khrushchev's so-called revelations can be supported from the evidence. That's Khrushchev Lied, the book that Raj referred to. But during the 1930s, Trotsky had made the same kinds of accusations against Stalin that Khrushchev later did. So the fact that Khrushchev did nothing but lie suggested that Trotsky must have lied as well. Thanks to Brouet and Getty, I already knew that Trotsky had lied about some very important matters. Any detective in any mystery story knows that if a suspect had lied about some important matters, he, the detective, should ask himself, what else is this person lying about? I formulated the hypothesis that Trotsky had lied about other matters too. Then I set about studying his writings in order to determine which of Trotsky's statements could be tested. My hypothesis was confirmed. Wherever I had independent evidence to check the veracity of any accusation that Trotsky leveled against Stalin, I found that Trotsky was lying. Again, the more I read and researched, the more lies of Trotsky's I discovered. In 2010, I published an article titled, quote, Evidence of Leon Trotsky's Collaboration with Germany and Japan. It is well more than 100 pages long. But today I have so much evidence that even a whole book does not come close to holding it all. So there will be 2 more volumes concerning Trotsky's lies. The second volume will be published either in December of this year or possibly in April of 2017. Also, in 2010, Swedish researcher Sven-Erik Holmström published an article on the Hotel Bristol question in the first Moscow trial of August 1936. In it, Holmström proves that Trotsky was lying here too. Between September 2010 and January 2013, I researched and wrote a book on the assassination on December 1st, 1934, of Sergei Mironovich Kirov, first secretary of the Leningrad Party. That book, The Murder of Sergei Kirov, was published in June 2013. You have some copies here. The Kirov murder is the key to the Soviet high politics of the rest of the 1930s. It leads directly to the 3 public Moscow trials of August 1936, January 1937, and March 1938, often called show trials. It leads to the military purge, or Tukhachevsky affair, of May and June 1937. and to the Yezhovshchina, or so-called Great Terror, of July 1937 to October 1938, during which NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov, NKVD means the Commissariat of Internal Affairs, which includes the political police, NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov had several 100,000 innocent persons killed. Anti-communist scholars called these last events the Great Terror, after a particularly dishonest book by Robert Conquest. In The Murder of Sergei Kirov, I examined in detail the 3 books on the Kirov affair that make use of the evidence from former Soviet archives that we now have. By identifying and studying the primary source evidence, I proved that all 3 of these scholars are dishonest. They force their preconceived anti-Stalin conclusions onto the evidence and ignore or distort all the evidence that does not support these conclusions. Trotsky also wrote about the Kirov murder investigation. Trotsky identified the articles in the French communist and Soviet press that he relied upon. I discovered that Trotsky lied about what these articles on the Kirov murder investigation said. He could only do this by hoping that his readers would not compare what he wrote to the articles he claimed he was summarizing and using for evidence. Trotsky fabricated a story that Stalin and his men were responsible for Kirov's death. Once again, Trotsky's amalgam about the Kirov assassination was constructed by lying about what the articles he read in the French Communist Party newspaper Humanité and in Russian-language Soviet papers said. These are the journals to which Trotsky had access within only a couple of days of their publication in Moscow. Here, too, Trotsky's lies would have been immediately apparent to anybody who set Trotsky's articles side by side with the French and Russian newspaper articles that he had read and which he claimed he was closely studying and analyzing. Once again, it appears that no one had ever done that. The result was that Trotsky's falsified version of the Kirov assassination, which was that Stalin and the NKVD had killed Kirov, though perhaps by mistake, this version was taken up not only by Trotsky's followers, but by anti-communist Cold Warriors and by Nikita Khrushchev. In the completely fraudulent secret speech of February 1956, Khrushchev gave additional credibility to the Stalin killed Kirov story. Khrushchev and his speechwriters probably took this directly from Trotsky. Trotsky's tale that Stalin had Kirov killed passed from Khrushchev to professional anti-communist scholar propagandists like Robert Conquest and many others. In the late 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev's men were tasked to find evidence in the Soviet archives to support this story. Their high-level research team failed. Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's chief man for ideology, Politburo member, told them that they had not tried hard enough to find evidence against Stalin. Yakovlev sent them back to the archives to try again. Once again, the Politburo research team failed to find any evidence to even suggest that Stalin had had Kirov killed. To placate their disappointed bosses, Gorbachev's research team resurrected the cover story of the secret opposition plot that had killed Kirov in the first place. This cover story was, and remains, that Leonid Nikolaev, the man who shot Kirov, was a lone gunman. This is still the official story that all mainstream anti-communists repeat, except for Trotskyists, many of whom continue to believe Trotsky's version, which was that Stalin did. In 2010, American historian Matthew Leno published an 800-page book with Yale University Press titled The Kirov Murder in Soviet History. Sure enough, Leno claims to prove that Nikolaev was a lone gunman, and that Stalin used this basically apolitical murder as an opportunity to frame and execute his political enemies. Like all overtly anti-communist historians, Leno has very nice things to say about Leon Trotsky. This remains the official version of Kirov's murder. In my 2013 book, The Murder of Sergei Kirov, I proved from primary source evidence that Leno and the other 2 renowned historians who tell this story are lying. The history of the Stalin had Kirov killed fabrication is a good example of how a number of Trotsky's deliberate lies were taken up by Soviet anti-communists like Khrushchev and Gorbachev, and by pro-capitalist anti-communists in the West. It shows how useful Trotsky and the Trotskyists, who continue to solemnly repeat Trotsky's lies, have been and still are to the pro-capitalist anti-communists. In Trotsky's amalgams, I uncover and discuss a number of other deliberate lies by Trotsky about Stalin and the Soviet Union. All of them have been adopted by anti-communists and by Trotskyists. In the second and third volumes of this work, I will discuss Trotsky's conspiracies with saboteurs and fascists inside the Soviet Union and with the Nazi and Japanese militarists. In early 1937, Trotsky succeeded in persuading John Dewey, the famous educator, and a number of others to hold hearings, supposedly to determine whether the charges leveled against Trotsky in the August 1936 and January 1937 Moscow show trials were true. The Dewey Commission published 2 fat volumes, over 1,000 pages in all. The Commission duly concluded that Trotsky was innocent and the Moscow trials were all a frame-up. I carefully studied the 1,000+ pages of the Dewey Commission materials. I discovered that the Commission was dishonest and shockingly incompetent. It made error after error in logical reasoning. But of most interest is the fact that Trotsky lied to the Dewey Commission many times. There is simply no way that the Dewey Commission could possibly have declared Trotsky not guilty, as they did, if the Commission members had known that Trotsky was lying to them, or if they had known as much of the truth as we know today. I wish to briefly mention 2 more sections of my book, Trotsky's Amalgams. They are, first, my project to verify, that is, to check, the Moscow trials testimony. And secondly, my examination of the errors that most readers of Soviet history make. Errors which make them unable to understand the significance of the evidence we now have. The testimony of the defendants in the 3 public Moscow trials is universally declared to be false, forced from innocent men by the prosecution, the NKVD, Stalin. There has never been a shred of evidence to support this notion. Nevertheless, it is staunchly affirmed by all specialists in Soviet history, as well as by all Trotskyists, of course. Thanks to years of identifying, searching for, locating, obtaining, and studying primary sources, I realized that there now exists enough evidence to test many of the statements made by the Moscow trials defendants. Trotsky's lies are an important part of this verification process. I devote the first 12 chapters of Trotsky's Amalgam, more than half the book, to a careful verification of many of the statements made by the Moscow trials defendants. I found that whenever we can double-check a fact claim made by a Moscow trials defendant against independent evidence now available, it turns out that the Moscow trials defendant was telling the truth. Trotsky, Khrushchev and his men, Cold War Soviet experts, Gorbachev and his men, and today's academic scholars in Soviet studies all claimed or claim that the trials are frame-ups. I prove from the evidence that they are wrong. The Moscow trials testimony is what it claims to be. Statements that the defendants chose to make. I verify this with a great deal of evidence from outside the trials themselves and even outside the Soviet Union. This is an important conclusion. This result in itself disproves the anti-Stalin paradigm of Soviet history. It also contributes to disproving Trotsky's version of Soviet history, a version that the Trotskyist movement worldwide continues to propagate today. As you probably know, it's particularly strong in the United States. We, and by we I mean those of us, researchers, activists, and others who wish to find the truth about Soviet history of the Stalin period, and not merely attempt to bolster or support our preconceived ideas about it, right? We who are interested in the truth. We are in possession of a number of results that completely overturn the conventional anti-Stalin paradigm of Soviet history. Now here comes the list. These are: point, the fact that Nikita Khrushchev lied about every accusation he made against Stalin and Beria in his world-shaking secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956. This clearly means that Khrushchev's researchers could not find any true crimes that Stalin or Beria had committed. So they were reduced to fabrication, because if they had been able to find any true crimes, why wouldn't he have said it? But he didn't. Point, the fact that despite a very thorough and time-consuming search of the archives in 1962 to 1964, Khrushchev's Schwernik Commission could find no evidence at all to suggest that either the Moscow trials defendants or the Tukhachevsky affair defendants were victims of a frame-up or had lied in their confessions in any way. Point, the fact that neither Gorbachev's and Yeltsin's researchers nor the anti-communist researchers since their time, who have had wide access to the former Soviet archives, have been able to find any evidence at all to impeach the conclusions in the Kirov's assassination, the Moscow trials, or the military purges. Point, the fact that the testimony of the Moscow trials was in the main truthful. Point, the fact that the investigations carried out after the removal of Nikolai Yezhov as People's Commissar of the NKVD, under the new Commissar Lavrentiy Beria, produced a great deal of evidence that Yezhov and Yezhov alone, not Stalin and his supporters of the Soviet leadership, were responsible for the mass murders of July 1938 to November 1939, known to scholars as the Yezhovshchina and to anti-communist propagandists as the Great Terror.
Excuse me, did you mean 37 to 38 or 38?
38 to 37 to 38. Yes, sorry. Very good. July 37 to November 38. The fact that most of today's scholars of the Stalin period in the Soviet Union lie and deceive their readers. Lie to and deceive their readers. But they do so in a way that can only be discovered by a very close, detailed study of their sources. Point. The fact that the major Trotskyist historians lie, fabricate, and give free rein to their biases, rather than the evidence, to dictate the conclusions they reach in their books and articles. Trotskyist scholarship is consistently parasitical on mainstream anti-communist scholarship. Here is one example. In a recent review of Stephen Kotkin's book, Stalin, on the Trotskyist and ferociously anti-Stalin World Socialist website, that's wsws.org, a Trotskyist reviewer refers approvingly to the anti-Stalin statements of Oleg Khlevniuk, who is called, quote, the respected Russian historian Oleg Khlevniuk. Khlevniuk is not only a ferocious anti-communist, he is also a very blatant liar in all of his writings. What is a supposed Marxist-Leninist, that is the Trotskyist reviewer, doing, quoting the world's foremost anti-communist and, of course, anti-Stalin liar? Evidently, the answer is this. Khlevniuk is anti-Stalin. WSWS.org, the Trotskyist publication, is anti-Stalin. Therefore, the Trotskyists trust the foremost anti-communist liar in the world today. Meanwhile, mainstream anti-communist scholarship has been drawing upon the writings of Trotsky himself for decades. And finally, some more points. Point, the fact that Trotsky himself, in his writings about the Soviet Union during the period after the Kirov murder, lied over and over and over again in order to cover up his conspiracies. Trotsky, of course, knew that he was lying about the bloc of rights, Trotskyists, Zinovievites, and other oppositionists, about his involvement with the assassination of Sergei Kirov in December 1934, about his conspiring with the Tukhachevsky affair's military conspirators for a coup d'etat against the Stalin government, about the fact that, if the coup d'etat plan failed, they plotted to stab the Red Army in the back during an invasion by Germany and Japan, about his conspiring with the Nazis and the Japanese militarists, about conspiring with fascists and his own followers within the Soviet Union to sabotage industry, transportation, and mines, about the charges against and the confessions by the defendants in the Moscow trials, which Trotsky knew were true. Moreover, Trotsky knew that he lied repeatedly over and over again in his own journal, the Bulletin of the Opposition. Trotsky knew that he repeated these lies to the Dewey Commission. And Trotsky knew that he lied to his own followers, including his closest followers like Andras Nin and Erwin Wolf. Andres Nin was one of Trotsky's closest workers, a secretary. Trotsky called his major political aide secretary, sort of like Secretary of State, not like clerk typist, right? So that's what he meant by secretary. Nin was one of these secretaries. Nin is supposed to have broken with Trotsky in 1931 over political issues. But in 1930, Nin wrote that Trotsky's Soviet-based followers, those who had retracted their Trotskyist views and pledged loyalty to the Communist Party's line, had done so dishonestly. They had done so in order to remain within the party so they could continue to recruit others to their secret conspiracy. Nin published this in a Trotskyist journal in 1930. Therefore, we can't be sure that Nin really did break with Trotsky. Moreover, his actions in Spain make it appear as though he did not. The Spanish communists and the Soviet NKVD in Spain suspected this too. Nin became one of the leaders of the PUM, an anti-Soviet and anti-Stalin party that was very friendly to Trotsky. Erwin Wolf, who believed what Trotsky said, went to Spain as Trotsky's political emissary. He did so in order to lead a revolution against the Spanish Republic, right in the middle of a war with the Spanish fascists who were aided by Hitler and Mussolini. Nin and Wolf ran these risks because they believed that Trotsky was innocent of all the charges that were made against him in the Moscow trials. They thought that Trotsky, not Stalin, was the true communist and true revolutionary. Consequently, they thought that they were going to Spain to do what Lenin would have wanted done. In May 1937, a revolt against the Spanish Republican government broke out in Barcelona. PUM and the Spanish Trotskyists enthusiastically participated in this revolt. It appears that Nin and Wolf thought this might be the beginning of a Bolshevik-style revolution, with themselves as Lenin, the PUM as the Bolsheviks, the Republican government as the capitalists, and the Spanish and Soviet communists as the phony socialists like Alexander Kerensky. The Barcelona May Days revolt was a vicious stab in the back against the Republic during wartime. It was suppressed in less than a week. After that, the Spanish police and Soviet NKVD hunted down the Trotskyists and the PUM leadership. Andres Nin was certainly kidnapped, interrogated, and then murdered by the Soviet and or Spanish police. The same thing probably happened to Erwin Wolf. Other Trotskyists may have been killed too, though we don't have any evidence. The Soviets knew what we now know, that Trotsky was conspiring with the Germans and Japanese and with the Tukhachevsky affair military men. But Andres Nin and Erwin Wolf did not know this. They believed Trotsky's professions of innocence. Today we know about Trotsky's lies, or at least about many of them. We know that the Moscow trials were genuine, not fabrications. We know about Trotsky's conspiracies with Germany and Japan. If Andres Nin and Erwin Wolf had known what Trotsky knew, and what we now know today, would they have gone to Spain to try to carry out Trotsky's instructions? Highly unlikely. Therefore, Trotsky sent these men into a very dangerous situation by means of lying to them about his own activities and aims, and about what Stalin was doing. And it cost them their lives. The same is true for all the Trotskyists who were executed in the Soviet Union itself. Evidently, there were hundreds of them. They all supported Trotsky because they believed his version of Soviet history, and had been convinced by Trotsky's writings that Stalin was lying, that the Moscow trials were a frame-up, and that the Stalin regime had abandoned the goal of worldwide socialist revolution. These men and women would not have followed Trotsky, or very few of them would have followed Trotsky, if he had not lied to them. I would like to point out two conclusions that we should draw from these results, all of which are firmly based on primary source evidence. First, we should assume as a first-order hypothesis that all anti-Stalin books and articles, whether by overt anti-communists or by Trotskyists, are based on lies, suppression of evidence, and other forms of deception. We should conclude that these lies and deceptions are employed because the true facts of Stalin-era Soviet history, including the true facts about the errors made by the Stalin leadership, do not serve the purposes of the anti-communists and Trotskyists. They do not make the USSR look bad. Therefore, lying and deception are essential to the Trotskyist, anarchist, social democratic, and anti-communist projects. Second, the entire Trotskyist movement is and always has been based upon the acceptance of Trotsky's lies as the truth. In the first chapter of Trotsky's Amalgams, I examined the errors that most students of Soviet history, including academic professionals, make when faced with primary source evidence. The truth is that very few people, including professional historians, know how to examine historical evidence. Amazing, right? Very few Marxists know what a materialist examination of evidence looks like, or are capable of recognizing or critiquing an idealist argument when they are confronted with one. In this section of the book, I discuss some matters that are essential issues for anyone who wants to know the truth about history about anything. Source criticism of evidence, the danger of logical fallacies, the need for and lack of objectivity. Here, the issue of, quote, confirmation bias, it's a good phrase, is important. If we want to learn the truth, we have to recognize the danger of confirmation bias and take concrete steps to deal with it. By confirmation bias, I mean the tendency to look with favor on those bits of evidence that tend to confirm what we already believe, and to give scant attention to slight any evidence that tends towards disproving what we already believe. I would be happy to discuss these important issues with you during the Q&A if you like. I urge you not to skip this section of the book. These errors are not only errors of denial by persons who do not wish to have their pro-Trotsky or anti-Stalin preconceptions disproven. Most or all of these same errors are made by pro-Stalin, anti-revisionist people. Anti-communist arguments have been so overwhelming, not only in Cold War pro-capitalist form, but especially perhaps in supposedly pro-communist, but in reality anti-communist, Khrushchev and Gorbachev era writings, that this has degraded the thinking of all of us. In addition, I would like to raise the question of, quote, the big lie. This may be the most important instrument of propaganda. It was classically described by Hitler in Mein Kampf, though Hitler himself says he took it from the field of public relations and the use of propaganda by the Allies during World War I. For the sake of brevity, let me just mention a few matters that are almost never questioned because the big lie has been so successful in promoting them that they are normally taken for granted. Stalin was a dictator. This is false. We have a lot of evidence that Stalin was never a dictator in any sense of the word. In 2004, Stephen Wheatcroft, one of the best of the mainstream anti-Stalin historians of the Soviet Union, published an article arguing that Stalin had not been a dictator. It's called Team Stalin. This article is seldom, if ever, cited. Another big lie. The Soviet Union was a police state. This is also false, but hardly ever questioned. Another one. The Soviet Union was a totalitarian state. This too is false. The term totalitarian was invented by Mussolini to describe fascist Italy. He was proud of it, of course. It was Trotsky who first applied it to the Soviet Union for the purpose of comparing the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany and Stalin to Hitler. And it is commonly used today as though it were simply obviously true, right? Totalitarian. I submit that we, you and I, should never let anyone use these terms to describe the Soviet Union during Stalin's time without challenge. The lies of Trotsky's that Brouet and Getty discovered more than 25, and really more than 30 years ago, have been ignored. This fact itself deserves explanation. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Brouet continued to find and write about more lies by Trotsky. But all the while, he continued to deny that these lies were of any importance. Brouet also ignored Getty's two discoveries. First, that the Trotsky archive had been purged of incriminating materials. Second, that Trotsky had indeed remained in contact with oppositionists like Karl Radek, with whom he swore he had broken off all ties. Vadim Rogovin, the leading Trotskyist historian of the Stalin-era Soviet Union, sure you've heard his name, went along with Brouet's covered-up and also introduced some lies of his own. I discussed one or two of them in my book. Trotskyists and Cold Warriors continued either to ignore Brouet's discoveries altogether or to echo Brouet's claim that the discovery of these lies was of little to no significance. We can understand why they do this. The fact that Trotsky lies dismantles what I call the anti-Stalin paradigm, the Trotskyist and the Cold War anti-communist versions of Soviet history. Trotsky, of course, had to lie. He was running a major conspiracy to get rid of Stalin, in conjunction with many supporters inside the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Party, and in collusion with Nazi Germany, militarist Japan, England, and France. A conspiracy requires secrecy and lying. In other words, once you say, all right, let's concede that he has a conspiracy, then it follows that he's going to have to lie, right? But who, above all, was Trotsky fooling? Not Stalin and the Soviet government. They knew he was lying. The conclusion is inescapable that Trotsky was mainly aiming to fool his own supporters. His supporters were the only people who believed whatever Trotsky wrote. They believed Trotsky was the true principled Leninist that he claimed to be, and that it was Stalin that was the liar. This cost the lives of most of his supporters inside the Soviet Union, when Trotskyism was outlawed as treason to the Soviet state because of Trotsky's conspiracy with Germany and Japan. It came Isaac Deutscher's trilogy, Trotsky the Prophet Armed, 1954, Trotsky the Prophet Unarmed, 1959, and Trotsky the Prophet Outcast, 1963. Deutscher, a former Trotskyist who remained very loyal to his old leader, portrayed Trotsky as an idealistic communist who struggled heroically, but in vain, against the monstrous Stalin and the so-called Stalinist Soviet Union. Trotsky's widow, Natalia Sedova, granted Deutscher privileged access to the Trotsky closed archives at Harvard University. This archive was finally opened to researchers in January 1980. Within a few weeks, Pierre Brouet, the foremost Trotskyist historian in the world, had discovered documents in it that proved that Trotsky had lied in his public statements and writings, and as the years passed, Brouet and other historians discovered more and more of Trotsky's lies. Deutscher, who had access to these same materials, never revealed any of this. Either he was incompetent, perhaps blinded by his bias in Trotsky's favor, or he was dishonest and deliberately covered up Trotsky's lies, or both. But those books are really terrible, and they are praised everywhere. Read my book. Today it is still the Trotsky version of Soviet history, borrowed by the pro-capitalist anti-communists, who have added some lies of their own, that passes for the official Soviet history of the Stalin period. This completely false account is the only version allowed in schools, universities, and the mass media. It is the version of Soviet history that most people who consider themselves Marxists, socialists, or on the left in any way, believe. Trotsky's lies about Stalin and the Soviet Union of his day have done as much harm as the lies of Khrushchev, Gorbachev, and the avowedly anti-communist scholars. This is why the discovery that Trotsky lied early, lied often, and lied about almost everything, is essential to anyone who wishes to fight for a better world. César. Unfortunately, it is not only the Trotskyists and the Cold War anti-communists who have been ignoring Trotsky's lies. More important for those of us here, Trotsky's lies have been ignored by the anti-revisionist pro-Stalin communist movement the world over. What does the fact that Trotsky lied, that Khrushchev lied, and that these facts were ignored for so long mean? What does it mean for the main question that faces us and billions of working people in the world today? I mean the question of why the wonderful international communist movement of the 20th century collapsed. The movement that 70 years ago, triumphant in World War II, in the Chinese Communist Revolution, in the anti-colonial movements around the world, seemed to be poised to bring about an end to capitalism and the victory of world socialism. How does it help us understand how a criminal like Nikita Khrushchev could become the leader of the Soviet Union and of the world communist movement? All too often we have been so busy defending the legacy of Stalin and the Stalin-era Soviet Union that we have failed to squarely face the other side of this question. Why did Stalin fail? Because he, meaning us, ultimately, meaning the international communist movement of his day, did ultimately fail. Stalin was followed by Khrushchev, and Khrushchev, with his lies about Stalin, did more to advance anti-communism, cynicism about the communist movement, and the eventual downfall of the world communist movement than all the capitalists in the world had ever done. How do we convince workers, students, and others that we know why the old communist movement failed, and that we have learned what we have to do differently to avoid repeating those failures in the future? We must study this question. We also need to discuss it, to entertain and debate different informed viewpoints. Therefore, we have to defend the legacy of the international communist movement during Lenin's and especially during Stalin's time. At the same time, we must be fearlessly critical of it, so that we discover what errors they made, and so not to make the same errors again. History can't teach lessons directly, and history isn't political theory. But if we ask the right questions, history can help us answer them. In my opinion, the single greatest error made by the Soviets was the retention of market mechanisms, commodity production, and differences in income, especially those between workers and peasants on the one hand, and party members on the other. Lenin and the Bolsheviks inherited their concept of socialism from the Second International. They, of course, had the most left form of this concept of socialism. But I think the evidence shows that they still did not break sharply enough from this concept. If you wish, we can discuss this more in the Q&A period. In my judgment, and I hope that it is yours as well, discovering the reasons for the collapse of the magnificent international communist movement of the 20th century is the most important historical and theoretical question for all exploited people today, the vast majority of humankind. To have any hope of solving it, we must think boldly. We must go where no one has gone before. Remember Star Trek? If we pretend that, quote, Marx and Engels had all the answers, or Lenin had all the answers, many Maoists literally believe that Mao had all the answers. Many Trotskyists, of course, believe that Trotsky had all the answers. If we believe that, we are guaranteed at best to fall far short of where the international communist movement of the 20th century, of what they achieved. Marx said that the great historical events occur twice. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. Remember, that's the beginning of the 18th Revolution of Napoleon. The tragedy of the international communist movement of the 20th century was that ultimately it failed. That's the tragedy. Unless we figure out where they went wrong, then we are doomed to be the farce. And that would be a political crime. Our crime. So we have to look with a critical eye at all of our legacy. Marx's favorite saying was, De omnibus dubitandum. Question everything. Marx would be the last person in the world to exclude himself from this question. Meanwhile, we should all publicize everywhere and in every way we can that, like Khrushchev and Gorbachev, Trotsky lied. Provably, demonstrably lied. And what's more, that all the anti-Stalin, anti-communist experts anointed by capitalist universities and research institutes, they're all lying too. We need to point out that the only way forward is to build a new communist movement to get rid of capitalism. And to do that, we need to learn from the heroic successes, as well as from the tragic errors of the Bolsheviks during the period when the Soviet Union was led by Joseph Stalin. My hope and my goal is to contribute through my research to this project, which is so vital for the future of working people everywhere. Thank you.